Hi folks, we're going to discuss Chapter 10 of the course text, A Desktop Guide for Nonprofit Directors, Officers, and Advisors. And I just want to point out some of the pieces that I think are important with regard to the learning objectives for this week that you read in this chapter. The first being under Chapter 10, Section 1, Truth and Solicitation. I think it's important to note that when we are soliciting for funds with donors, that we have an obligation to be truthful in what we are going to be doing with the donations. In fact, question 2 of this week's assignment talked about the woman who came into the nonprofit and left the money for the work in Africa that had recently been advertised by the nonprofit organization, when in fact that nonprofit had not been doing any work in Africa. I think you have a couple of choices at that point when a mistake has been advertised to the public and you have donors relying on that. One being that you need to disclose that no work has in fact been done and that was a mistake, that you are willing to use those funds for work in Africa if and when the organization does undergo that. And again, that would be something for the board to make a decision whether that was even within their mission would be to do that work in Africa. I think you also have, the right at that point to engage the potential donor in a conversation as to the work that your nonprofit actually does do and see if you could persuade her to let you use the donation for the current missions that are underway. And I guess your last resort is to return the funds to her should that not be any of her choices. The other piece that I want to point out is that the book makes a note that much of this truth and solicitation really came about after September 11th and the Red Cross being the poster child, I think, for an example of what not to do when soliciting funds. And I don't think it was an intentional act on behalf of the Red Cross. I think it was more of never having been called on how their funds were used before and being made responsible to answer to so many donors who had an interest in seeing that the money that they were donating was going to the victims of 9/11 rather than just the general operation that happened to include some aspect of it going to 9/11 victims. These folks really were interested in their dollars going directly to those affected by 9/11, and that's really where this comes out of. The chapter overall, the points to take a close look at are pledges and how you want to deal with pledges. That there be a in-house policy, that your gift acceptance committee has put into some kind of procedural documentation how to accept pledges. Again, this goes to question 3 of this week's learning assignment, where I think it's Celebrity McNeil offers a pledge to the nonprofit organization and then in turn is asking for, without completing the pledge, a substantiation letter for the amount and all the possible exposure and the issues that brings up for a nonprofit organization. Again, pledges are a tricky piece of the donor policy. I think it is a good housekeeping rule to make sure that you are making contracts with folks who are donating to the nonprofit organization. You want to have these contracts done in writing. You want them signed by the person that's making the pledge, and if they are married, for their spouse to be signing those pledges. On page 438 of Chapter 10, The author speaks about some of the specifics that you want to have in your pledge contract, and he's suggesting that you avoid calling it a letter of intent, because that really says that it's not meant to be a final commitment, and you're looking for something that is really going to be a written document requiring that those donations be made. And you want to set out specific dates and amounts on which the pledge will be completed. A payment schedule with dates is an important piece of this. You want to know any damages that the nonprofit organization would suffer as a result of relying on that pledge if it was not to come through. That would help the nonprofit organization in the future if it had to sue the donor, which again is a very bad policy to get yourself into. But if you had to, at least you could explain to the court that the donor knew the damages that would be suffered as a result of failing to meet the obligation under the pledge. Another point that I think is pointed out in the next section under the high pressure tactics is that you want to make the contract enforceable against the estate of the donor should that donor pass away before he has completed or she has completed all of the contributions or donations that she or he committed to. You want to be able to pursue that through their estate, and it would be helpful if the spouse, who may still be alive and probably administering the estate, was also a required party or a responsible party on that contract. It would make it a lot easier for you to enforce that the contract, and seeing that those donations were made through the deceased party's estate. You want to avoid high pressure tactics. It is bad policy to, in general, use these tactics on working with folks to either become donors or engage in the nonprofit in any way. People who are asked to enter into agreements when they are under pressure usually afterwards are very upset because they feel like it was not something of their own free will. They were forced to do it. They're going to be resentful, likely not follow through on any promises that they made. It is a bad policy for the nonprofit organization to be associated with using those kinds of tactics. We've talked about that previously in the course, about those that you may hire as third parties to solicit funds for you. You want to make sure that you are monitoring and have set clear expectations for those folks as to how that business is to be done. And if people are asking, to be taken off a call list, or don't contact them any further, even though you may not, as a nonprofit organization, have to comply with that request, you should reply with that request. You do not want bad word of mouth out there with regard to the business practices of a nonprofit organization, in particular when it's a third party doing it on your behalf. So some control over those relationships and over your own personal relationships with potential donors is exceptionally important about how we go about presenting ourselves in the world, and asking for people to work with us to support our mission and move our mission forward. I think the other piece that's important to talk about with pledges is the enforceability of it. It's really an undefined area of law whether a court would enforce a donor to comply with a donation promise that had been made. I think you have a much better chance of being successful should there be reliance on that under a written contract that talks about the damages that would occur if you did not receive that donation. I think that you stand a much better chance in that position. I think that there is the other side of the equation, which is if you don't complete a donation or comply with the donation, especially if it's a restricted gift as a donor has requested, that I think that the nonprofit could be sued for failure to comply with and manage an asset given to it by a donor who had given a specific or restricted gift with a specific set of instructions as to how that was to be handled. I think it's important when the restricted gifts, when any donation comes in, I think it's important to work with the donor. It fosters a future relationship with them, but to work with them on how do they expect that donation to be used. Don't just assume. Really work through it with them and build a relationship of trust. And, you know, if it is a restricted gift, I think you have to talk about building a document to manage that donation. So that the expectations of the donor are clear and the obligations on the nonprofit organization are clear. And some of those pieces are talked about later in this chapter with regard to taking into consideration what would happen if a gift failed, if you were unable to complete the expectations of what a donor's intent was when you originally accepted it, even if it's 10 years after accepting that donation. Those pieces have to be worked through with the donors. It's slow, tedious work. It is work that most people don't want to have to discuss about what happens if something goes wrong. But I think as a board of director and a member, you are doing yourself and future board members a great favor if you can problem solve and think about reasonable issues that could arise for you in the future and how those would be managed. In fact, the book also talks about, you know, thinking about the fact if you were to pledge a specific asset or use it as collateral for a loan on behalf of the nonprofit, is that something that the restricted gift even allows you to do? And you got to be able to go back to a document that was drafted with the understandings and intents of the donor to determine whether you're even in a position to be able to use that for collateral. Under the financial statement, the treatment of a pledge, they are treated as temporarily restricted gifts. I think it is important to point out that they are received, you treat them as being received in the period that they are received in, going back to the McNeil, the celebrity McNeil, asking for a substantiation letter before he ever intended to complete even a piece of the donation is a problem. When you start to receive those donations, I think you are then in a position, based on the donation received and during that period, to provide a substantiation letter. And that's going to put a nonprofit in a tough place because you want to build those relationships with donors. You want to try to give them what they're asking for in order to keep up that goodwill and keep them providing and donating to your nonprofit organization. However, there's exposure and liability, and you are putting at risk the status of the nonprofit organization should you do that and not have been in a position to have done that. So a great piece to take a look at. Also, let's see here. I'm now looking at page 450, and again, I just kind of mentioned the thoughts that go into restricted gifts and whether you use those as pledges for loans. Nonprofits in general can use the assets that they have for loans if need be, and I think as a board, again, the decision becomes what's the exposure for putting that up as collateral if we are unable to meet the loan requirements, and that takes some real serious thought and working through as a board to decide whether you're going to do that or not. Another potential question is for an organization to ask for a nonprofit to loan it funds. And the question for the board becomes, why are they asking for the money? Are they in financial distress? And is that the best use based on a fiduciary responsibility of the nonprofit's assets, especially if there is a likelihood that you may not be paid back? All of the pieces that have to be considered in making a decision like that. Does the risk, does the benefit outweigh the risk involved in it? And it's a judgment call, but it's one that can be done with proper discussion and homework and documented, as we've talked about how important it is to document the meetings of the minutes so that you remember why the decision was made if something goes wrong. Let's see here. Moving on to asset sales, another piece just to highlight for you. Again, one that if you have an asset, you need to take a look at whether it was a restricted asset and whether there's a stipulation with regard to whether it can even be sold or not. Likely, if somebody has left you a restricted gift, there's some limitation on how you dispose of that asset. And you want to be sure that you're complying with all of the donor's intents and taking into consideration that you're treating that gift, that donation exactly as discussed. Under Chapter 10 in Section 6, it talks about changed circumstances. There's two legal theories that govern how we deal with gifts that potentially fail. And those are cypress and equitable deviation. Cypress, and it states, if you read right out of the chapter, is a trust law doctrine that the courts apply to a restricted gift when the designed charitable purpose becomes unlawful, impractical, or impossible to carry out. So therefore, the court's going to step in if a gift is going to fail, and they're going to find a way to try to satisfy as best as possible the initial intent of the donor with carrying out that gift. As for the doctrine of equitable deviation, it addresses what happens when the means for carrying out a gift's purpose becomes impossible, impractical, illegal, obsolete, ineffective, or prejudicial to the public interest to carry out. So they are the safety nets to catch gifts before they fail and are no longer being used for a purpose, a beneficial purpose as initially designed. I think some other pieces of this that are important to note is that you should have a gift acceptance policy. There should be a gift acceptance committee that has put some procedure into place about how the organization is going to work with cash donations or cash, the equivalent of a cash donation. How do you document that properly so that there are not questions later as to what happened with the asset? Perhaps you have two people involved in every cash transaction, that a cash receipt is given immediately, that the donor signs off on, as well as the organization, so it can't be alleged that money was not brought into the organization. That puts both the employees of the nonprofit and the donor in an uncomfortable position of having to discuss what actually happened with the $3,000 that was left on the table. Publicly traded securities, the question becomes, are we in a business to manage those? Is there anybody with the knowledge? How much would it cost us to manage that asset so that we're fulfilling our fiduciary duty? Or is that something that we should sell upon receipt? And how do you handle that? And these procedures need to be thought about ahead of time so that when the donor shows up with the donation, you're not making up policy on the spot. It's going to be worth it to think about it and to plan for the future and be ready for those donations when they come in. Real estate's another asset that really needs to have some careful consideration built around whether a nonprofit organization wants to accept or what it does with a real estate donation. There's a great deal of liability and exposure that comes about with owning real estate, and the nonprofit needs to calculate before being placed in the position of owning that asset whether it is even in a position to manage it or wants to do the work and educate itself as a board as necessary in order to manage the asset. Let's see here. The other one I'll point out is bargain sales. If an asset comes out of some kind of a bargaining agreement and there isn't a fair market value placed on that, it's important with any asset that doesn't have a fair market value that a donor is providing to have, and certainly the rules require as you get over $5,000, to have an independent appraisal done for that asset, because many times people think that assets are worth more than they truly are. And as a nonprofit, we're not in the business of deciding what the actual value of an asset is. It's better left to a third party and to express that to the donor and see if they'll agree that that's the value. And that's a good way to set a base value for an asset that you might not otherwise have a way to value. Let's see here. So the other point that I think is worth noting is in naming opportunities, when there might be a plaque or a building or anything that may have an advertisement on it from a donor, that you want to include a bad boy clause, as it's called, in your contract for that donation, and outline when and how that obligation on behalf of the nonprofit organization could be and might be revoked. For instance, there is a negative connotation now with a certain entity or a person that is causing public relations problems for a nonprofit because either a building is named after that person or an asset is credited to that person or business entity. You want to be able to rename it, or maybe just take the name off completely, but you want to have some rules in place so it's less likely that the donor is going to sue you for changing the name. And if you have some very clear outlines at the beginning that they buy into and sign off on, that's going to make it a lot easier for the nonprofit organization to enforce that. I think the other point that's important, it's a little beyond this course. Again, you do a specific grants program in the nonprofit management degree, is federal grants. I think it's important to say that as a nonprofit organization, if you are receiving federal grants, the federal government has strings tied to that, and you need to know what it is that you are obligating yourself to under those federal rules and regulations if you accept federal grants. Not only are you going to be required to account for the assets that you are given, the donations that you are given, but they're going to outline for you what costs are permissible under that, the auditing requirements that are permissible. You are going to have to manage the donation in a particular way. You are subject to, and should always follow anyway, but all of the federal laws that come into place with federal governance, and I'm talking about the Civil Rights Act in particular. Again, you may not be responsible as a nonprofit organization or subject to liability under the federal statute. You're likely to be subject under a similar state statute because of the number of employees required in a business. But because you accept the money from a federal grant, you now have subjected yourself to that jurisdiction. So you should be following the rules anyway. But it just opens up another level of regulation and laws that you as a nonprofit need to comply with. Let's see here. I think that wraps up Chapter 10, and we will be moving on to Chapter 11.